Good evening, everyone. As folks slowly continue to come on in here to the Carr Auditorium at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, I'm delighted to welcome folks both in person and online to the fifth of our conversations on democracy this year. My name is David Eichenthal. I'm joined here this evening by our guest, a good and old friend, Andrea Bernstein, who will be speaking with us tonight on a number of different topics. But most especially, Andrea has been one of the leading investigative reporters in the nation, looking at the business affairs of former President Donald Trump, and also looking at what really happened on January 6th. Two very important issues as we think about democracy here in Tennessee. Let me start with a few ground rules before we get into introducing Andrea in greater detail and starting our conversation. First of all, folks who are joining us online, welcome. If you have questions that come up during the course of this presentation, there's a feature online where you could submit those questions through the chat function. We'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation. Folks here in the auditorium, I think everyone should have received an index card as you were coming in, and we're pleased to take questions from you. If you just write them down on an index card, we'll collect them toward the time when we'll be doing questions and answers. Andrea, it's really great to have you here.
It is really great to be here. It's great for everybody here. This is the first in-person book talk that I've given in a long time, so thank you for having me.
So, Andrea, for those of you who haven't read the multiple emails that got you to join us this evening, he's a journalist, has frequently appeared on National Public Radio, has frequently appeared on PBS NewsHour. He's the author of really the definitive book, I think, on the relationship between the Trump family and the Kushner family when it comes to their histories and their business together, American Oligarchs, and has been the co-host of two podcasts that couldn't be more spot on for the topics we're talking about this evening. One was called Trump Inc., which really focused on President Trump's business dealings, both before he came to the White House, but then after. And then, I guess it was earlier this year, Will Be Wild came out, which was an investigative podcast that really focused on the January 6th insurrection. And you have now, we talked about this earlier, you have now just joined the ProPublica democracy team, so you'll be reporting very much on democracy issues for the
All of that is true.
So Andrea, I wanted to start almost on a personal note. We both had a very good friend, really a spectacular investigative journalist by the name of Wayne Barrett, who passed away the day before the inaugural, or days before?
The night before, yeah. The night before, January 19th, 2017.
And he had covered extensively and written extensively about Donald Trump and his time in New York City. I remember sort of growing up in New York City politics and New York City government and learning about Donald Trump, learning about his dad and his role. And I never really took Donald Trump very seriously, and I think that was true for a lot of New Yorkers, both in politics and out. Wayne did.
Wayne did.
What did he know that we didn't, or that I didn't at least realize?
So I think Wayne was paying attention, and Wayne Barrett was the first biographer of Donald Trump. His book was, it was called The Deals and the Downfall. And he wrote it in the early 90s, and this was after Donald Trump had crashed. And he writes in the introduction to his book that he had a contentious call with Donald Trump's publicist who said, do not title your book "The Deals and the Downfall, Trump Will Be Back." And the book that, Wayne Barrett, for those of us who are in New York City, was a sort of institution. He was a kind of a one-man muckraker. And of course, of putting together my book, I went to the University of Texas at Austin, where his papers are held, and there were probably 300 boxes of Wayne Barrett notes and papers and documents, and it was like a history of New York City corruption from his entire career. He was a reporter at the Village Voice newspaper, later went on to The Nation and the Daily Beast. But I visited him about a month before he died. He was on an oxygen tank, and he was reporting while he was on his oxygen tank and kept interrupting our meetings to take phone calls. So that was Wayne Barrett, and Wayne was sort of really a kind of a, both when I was becoming a journalist in New York City and when I was writing this book, he was really an inspiration because, he used to answer his phone, yeah, here. And he'd have an answering machine, and he was just old school. And, the lessons that there are people that have never duplicated his work. And he took Trump seriously. He took the Trump sort of, the way Donald Trump used the world as, there were judges that he would help get appointed, and he felt that he could call on those judges. And this is something that goes all the way back to Brooklyn in the 1970s. And this was something that Wayne saw because he understood how to dissect how the levers of power unfold. And that kind of reporting was foundational. I mean, one of the things that was interesting about his book is his book was not a success when it was released. And presidents told me they were depressed, they thought the book was a failure. When Trump ran for president, after he became president in 2015, he became the authority on Donald Trump because, and now having witnessed his records, I understand why, he was able to obtain information that no one else had, no one matched to this day.
Did his earlier reporting and sort of influence or in a way guide some of the reporting that you did?
I guess less on January 6th, but sort of the MO of Donald Trump, probably in terms of his business affairs, didn't change.
I do think, and there's a book coming out tomorrow by Maggie Haberman, and from the advanced publicity, I think one of the big lessons is that Donald Trump does not change. That the methods that he employs, that he employed as president, that his father employed before him, are really tried and true. And you can sort of, his sense of power, his sense of how to wield influence, his sense of how to get control over people, his sense about, sort of, the salesmanship, if you will, how to sell an idea, how to sell himself, how to sell his business even when everything was failing and was the opposite of what he said. These are through lines that have held throughout his whole career.
And just sort of getting into it a little bit, and sort of how does business, that approach really came up both for Trump as a candidate in 2016 initially and in 2020, and we'll talk maybe about whether it would be a candidate in 2024. How did that approach really play out in the campaign? I mean, was there an art of the deal aspect to the 2016 campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the way that Donald Trump has been successful, I mean, one of the people who actually put this well was Michael Cohen's attorney. When Michael Cohen went to plead guilty, his attorney, Guy Petrillo, said to the judge, more than 70 million Americans were persuaded to vote for this man. He is incredibly persuasive. He also persuaded my client. And I think that there's a through line between how he, persuades voters and how he persuades the people who work for him. And of course, I've looked, really intently at the people who've worked for him and how he, maintains power, control, influence over the people who have worked for him. And it extends to the presidential circle. And, I think one of the things that, do most people here watch the January 6th committee hearings? Or So I think one of the things that we saw in those hearings was that, every witness that testified, I think almost all of them were Republicans. Almost all of them were people who were part of the Trump administration, many of them until the last days of the Trump administration. So these were people who had been through a lot. People who were there on January 6, 2021, really had seen a lot of Donald Trump, and yet they were willing to go along. And I think that is a real window into the psychology of Donald Trump, because he's so persuasive that even when he discards people. I mean, Bill Barr, his former Attorney General, an extremely loyal person to Donald Trump. Donald Trump turned on him after he said, basically, that the election wasn't fraudulent. And there was someone else, the acting Attorney General, Jeffrey Rosen, who came in believing that somehow he would be able to avoid the fate of Bill Barr. And of course, when he stood up to Donald Trump, he too was jettisoned. And, that happened through multiple chiefs of staff. It happened with attorneys general. It happened with, countless cabinet secretaries. I'm sure you could count them, but actually haven't counted the number in total. But that is one of the ways, is that he manages to persuade the next person in line that they, against their better judgment, they will not face the same fate as their predecessor.
And that type of persuasion where it really does go, I mean, not to cast aspersions, but he was a New York real estate guy.
He was a New York real estate guy, but one of the things that was interesting to me when I started reporting on Donald Trump's business, when I was working on my book, is, I spoke to many people in the real estate industry. High-level people, sort of comparable in stature to Donald Trump. He has sued people for saying that anybody is at his level. But, there were people who were much more successful real estate developers than Donald Trump. And these people and their aides and advisors would all wanted me to know one thing: he is not one of us. And they wanted me to understand that, New York real estate is kind of like oil in Texas. It's a limited resource that a few people control. And, oil is oil, housing is housing. So the way that you make it more profitable in New York is, whether it's commercial real estate or housing, what have you, retail, is that you convince people that yours is better. And everybody in New York does that. And if there's hyperbole all over the place, it's just that Donald Trump and the Trump family, and we know so much more now because of the various lawsuits and investigations and criminal investigations of former President Trump's company, that it was off the charts. It was actually not comparable to most other people in New York real estate. And we can just see that from the numbers. And, I recently read, not even 2 weeks ago, the sort of 200+ page civil complaint filed by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James. And it was just instance after instance after instance of his apartment. He tripled the square footage and tripled the value, or he had a building on 40 Wall Street, which is like a sort of, commercial tenants. And the appraisal came back at $200 million, but he wanted a big bank loan. So after he got 2 appraisals that put it sort of in the $200 million range, he just sort of threw it out and said it's worth $500 million to the next lender that came along. And even in the New York real estate world, that is outside of the bounds.
In some of the stuff, I found it, and I have not read the entire civil complaint, but based on the reporting, a lot of this were issues that I think you all raised on Trumping.
Yeah, we did a podcast episode, in fact, about that building, 40 Wall Street, which is called The Numbers Don't Match. One of the things about, Donald Trump that, he has a privately held company. He would require most people who worked with him, contractors, et cetera, to sign non-disclosure agreements. He didn't, like to respond to the press. He would, call up reporters and pretend to be his own PR person. So, it was hard to get information about him. And so But one of the things that has helped us learn about him is his own litigiousness. So he didn't like his New York City tax assessment. So he filed litigation. And under an obscure New York law, if you sue because you don't like your tax assessment, you have to release your city tax returns. So under the Freedom of Information request, we got his tax returns, and we were able to see, because his bank loan had been acquired by basically a bank that had to disclose what it was doing because it had to follow securities regulations. And the numbers didn't match. On one of them, he said, when it came to the bank loan, he said, oh, look, we're getting all this income, so much money, we're such a good bet. I'm simplifying. And when it came to the tax returns, the line was left blank. That would be where he had to pay the piper based on his income. And this over and over and over again. So this was just one example that we had unearthed. But when you look at the civil complaint, I mean, it's sort of, you take a golf course in California, Mar-a-Lago, his apartment. Again and again and again, you see these false valuations, alleged false valuations, that, and then when he reports them to insurance companies or to banks, he has one set of values according to this complaint. When he reports them to taxing authorities, he has another.
When you look at the complaint, and well, let's do this, for folks who don't know, talk a little bit about what the Attorney General in New York State did.
Yeah, so David mentioned that I am on, that I cover some stuff for NPR, and when Trump Inc., the podcast, the conceit was, there's a businessman president. And if there's a businessman president who is privately profiting, then we are going to have a journalistic project that tracks that, because he represents the people and he has a private business. So it came to an end when his presidency came to an end. At that time, we said to NPR, well, we'll track the legal fallout, thinking, oh, it's a couple of investigations. We had no idea that it was sort of going to be, every day would be Trump legal news. And that, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there is an awful lot. So, and one of the reasons is one of the reasons it's all sort of clustered together is that there, while Trump was president, he managed to, for example, the Manhattan District Attorney wanted his tax returns, and he didn't want to turn them over. So he went to the Supreme Court twice, because basically the Supreme Court said you have to turn them over, go through the lower courts, and he made it basically go all the way up again to the Supreme Court. So this is a case that, should have probably been resolved a long time ago, but he sort of strung it out and strung it out and strung it out. And that's just sort of one case by the Manhattan District Attorney. The case that was filed last month against the company it's a civil case brought by the New York Attorney General, so it's a different standard of proof. And, but along the way in steps, and now with this complaint, because Donald Trump didn't want to turn over documents, we've learned a lot along the way about how he ran his business, and there's been a lot of evidence that's been already placed in the public view, and that's even without the entire lawsuit, a potential trial, and whatever we may learn.
And just to be clear, right, the outcome of the civil litigation, because it's civil and not criminal, doesn't result in any sort of punishment in terms of prison or anything else, but there's a potential financial penalty.
The Attorney General has asked for a $250 million penalty, and essentially what she's asking for is that Donald Trump, Ivanka, Don Jr., and Eric Trump no longer be allowed to conduct business in New York State. So it's a pretty severe penalty that she's asking for. And one of the things that's sort of particular in New York law is that when you file a lawsuit like this in New York, you've already done a lot of discovery, you've obtained a lot of documents, you've done a lot of depositions, so it's evidentiarily pretty far along. Now, will it get slowed up? No doubt.
Well, and again, just sort of as reminders, right, it is the New York State Attorney General who went after Donald Trump's foundation as well.
The first major case that the New York Attorney General brought against Donald Trump was for his so-called university, which is not a university, and part of the problem was that he called it a university, and, you know, it was not like this university. It was like basically a kind of a sales pitch. And, you know, people would come into lecture halls and they would be pressured to spend lots of money to go to a higher level of real estate education, but each time it was basically to get them to spend more and more and more money. So that case, you may remember, was sort of bumping along during the 2016 campaign. At one point during that campaign, Donald Trump said the judge who was biased because the judge was of Mexican descent, Judge Curiel from, I believe it was from Illinois. But at the end of the day, that case was settled for something like $24 million. Fairly soon before Donald Trump became president. There was another case that started while Donald Trump was president, which was into his foundation, which resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement and also a declaration that Donald, Ivanka, Don Jr., and Eric Trump could not run a charity in New York for, I believe it was a period of 10 years.
With all of this civil litigation and all of this activity, I think some people might look at this and sort of say, well, you know, didn't all of this happen before he was president? Why is it even relevant to a conversation about, you know, democracy and what happened during the Trump presidency?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, there's a variety of answers to that question. Very interestingly, one of the things that I heard was that Donald Trump was asked a question about the previous district attorney in Manhattan, Bob Morgenthau, who was, you know, if you've seen Law and Order, that's who it's about. That sort of, you know, he'd been there for decades and, you know, was sort of seen as kind of the, you know, DA of all the DAs in the country.
I think the way to explain it is that Bob Morgenthau was Manhattan District Attorney longer than Law and Order has been on the air. Rather extraordinary if you think about it. We're going to take a brief water break.
Sorry. So he said, he told Maggie Haberman of the New York Times, Bob Morgenthau was my friend. This to me was a very telling remark. There's a lot of reporting, and much of it is in the book, about how Trump, when he was a real estate developer, made sure that he was extremely generous to prosecutors. So he and his father were among the biggest donors to Bob Morgenthau. Donald Trump, who did not like to go out to events unless they were his events, not only went to sort of, you know, the obligatory political fundraisers, but went to a fundraiser for Bob Morgenthau's favorite charity, which was the Police Athletic League. And he showed up every year, and there were people who work in Bob Morgenthau's office that told me they took note that Donald Trump came every year to this charity. So it was a sort of subtle way of saying, you know, I'm here, I'm your friend. He would take Chris Christie to lunch when he was the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey. He would, there were a couple of cases where he had, or not cases, but a couple of incidents where he had encounters with FBI agents involving his casinos. Some of them ended up going up in the helicopter or playing a round of golf with Donald Trump, who, you know, was at that time just a kind of, especially if you lived in New Jersey, he seemed like this sort of very celebrity New York businessman. So that was just one of the ways that he courted people. So when people had a call to make, when prosecutors had a call to make, Donald Trump wanted to make sure that the call would not be made against him. And, you know, he tried that sort of persuasiveness, you know, the sort of Midas touch. And when that didn't work, he would turn on people. And I think, you know, we've seen that now, how he has turned on people who I think were, you know, literally some of his best friends. who he thinks have gone against him.
So it's sort of a mode of operation again that carries on throughout his lifetime. That's about sort of conflicts and attempts to curry favor. I think I remember the story that when Wayne was doing the book, that he offered him an apartment in Trump Tower to, and as you say, when that doesn't work, when people say no, that's not the way I do things, then he threatens to sue them.
Yes, and he does. He has sued journalists on many occasions as well as others. And there's an incident that I wrote about recently for ProPublica. So we don't, just switching to another investigation, we don't know why Donald Trump took classified documents with him to Mar-a-Lago. But we do know that as a businessman, he had a pattern and practice of gathering information from people and deploying it to wield power. And I interviewed for this story the former governor of New Jersey, Christine Todd Whitman, who told me of an incident where Donald Trump did not want New Jersey.
We can't hear.
Can't hear.
I think we need, oh, there it goes. Yeah.
Now can you hear? Yes. Okay, was it just that minute that you lost?
Yeah.
Okay, so I spoke just last month to the former governor of New Jersey, Christine Todd Whitman, a Republican, who told me how when Donald Trump didn't want New Jersey to build a casino to Steve Wynn's casino, who was at the time Donald Trump's rival, they have since reunited, he called up with a piece of information that he had found out about a private party at one of his hotels where her then high school age son had become so intoxicated he had to go to the hospital. And according to Whitman, he said to her, "You wouldn't want people to find out about Taylor, would you?" And it was directly related to the tunnel that he didn't want her to approve. Well, she approved the tunnel. Now, neither Donald Trump nor Steve Wynn have casinos in Atlantic City, but it is an example of how he would sort of gather information. His former employees told me they felt like they were being spied upon and would use it to embarrass people. Did he plan to do that with the classified documents? We do not know. All we know is that was his practice as a businessman. I wanted to pick up on something in your question about what this means for democracy, because I think this is really, really important. Is that, the thing that I said about, New York real estate community, wanting me to understand that he was not one of them, that he was sort of outside the bounds, is an ethos that we see he also took to the White House. He is, the first president in the history of the United States that encouraged people to violently attack people who were trying to certify the election that he had lost. We've never seen anything like it. And there's a through line between Trump essentially saying business rules and laws don't apply to me. I can say what I want and do what I want, to the rules of democracy don't apply to me. And to setting that as an example for everybody else. And I think that is something alarming in what we've seen in the years, sort of almost 2 years now since Donald Trump left office, which is that a lot of people who are running for election now with that same kind of ethos of the rules don't apply. And what has allowed democracy to last all this time in this country is a common understanding that people will accept the rules, that people will be bound by the rules. And we are really sort of on a knife's edge about whether as a country we're going to ultimately agree that we need to have a set of rules that are going to commonly govern us, or we don't. And it's clear what direction Donald Trump has been pushing the country.
So let's talk about January 6th. You spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people I don't think other journalists have talked to in terms of family members and folks who were directly involved in January 6th. So we did a series of polls earlier this year about democracy in Tennessee. And among other things, we asked Tennessee voters whether they thought that what happened on January 6, 2021 was an insurrection, or whether they thought, as I believe it was the chair of the Republican National Committee referred to it as sort of a legitimate form of political discourse.
It was in a official communication from the Republican Party that censured Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, two members of Congress who were on the January 6th committee, where they all but excommunicated them from the party and said that, you know, what they were doing was investigating legitimate political discourse.
So, by a margin of 51% to 49%, Tennessee registered voters said that they thought it was a legitimate form of political discourse. Could you talk a little bit why you may disagree with that?
So, in our podcast, which is called Will Be Wild, for those of you who don't listen to podcasts, you have a little purple app on your iPhone and you can sign up tonight. It's named after the Trump tweet where he talks about, he says, there's a big protest in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, be there, will be wild. And in this podcast, we started thinking about doing this podcast fairly soon after January 6th. And I don't know if, you know, sort of, like right after January 6th, and even, you know, the leader, even people who are now defending the former president, such as House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, at the time was, we have to put a stop to this. Mitch McConnell, the Republican, let's see, at that time he was just become the minority leader in the Senate, made a speech at the impeachment where he was, you know, said that Donald Trump was morally responsible for what happened. Many corporations said they would not make any donations to the House members who had voted even after the attack not to certify the election. And I would say perhaps most significantly to me was during the Super Bowl of 2021, I don't know who here watched it or who online watched the Super Bowl in 2021, but there was a moment where the announcer said, and let's honor the police officers who defended the Capitol from the attack on January 6th. And to me, that was so symbolic of how, you know, sort of the country had this brief moment of feeling like this is not us, and saying this is not us. And as we began to report and watch the congressional hearings, what began to develop was something else, which is that the people, for example, Metropolitan Police Officer Michael Fanone, who is one of the people that I spent a lot of time with for the podcast, was one of the very early people to stand up and say, I want the world to know what happened on this day. And he began to be viciously attacked, personally, for telling the truth, even by some members of his own department. And members of Congress in the early days before the January 6th committee, various committees, the Judiciary Committee, the House Oversight Committee were looking into this. And those early hearings were awful because you had the Democrats sort of, you know, talking about we need to get to the truth, and the Republicans obfuscating, and then everybody sort of screaming, and no light was shed on what was going on. So that was the moment, I would say, when I really began to feel like, wow, we're actually not going to get to the bottom of this. And I think one of the things, well, was slightly wrong about that. But I think one of the things that really nobody expected, and I don't really know why, in retrospect, including me, done now 2 podcasts on Trump and wrote a book, but I don't think any of us really thought through what would be the effect of Donald Trump saying for years and years and years after his election, okay, 2 years almost, after he wasn't elected, of him saying, Biden was not legitimately elected, and making it a loyalty test, making it a literal loyalty test. He will campaign against people who say that Biden won the election, and you say it over and over and over again. And you know, I've been thinking a lot about the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who, you know, wrote about politics and truth, and she wrote about when people stop being able to distinguish what is true and what is false, we're really in trouble, because people, it's not just sort of the facts that are the problem, it's that a truth exists. And that's where we are right now, and I think that's what that poll shows. We are right there, right in the middle, where half of the people are like, I'm not going to believe the truth, and half of the people are like, I will. And, you know, it's sort of like, we're in a moment where that has to be taken very seriously.
One of the things you did, I think that was really interesting as part of Will Be Wild was, I guess, the conversations that you had with family members of some of the people who participated. I guess one young man basically called the FBI on his father, right?
Yeah. This was a really striking story. This is the Reffitt family from Dallas. And Guy Reffitt was actually, I mean, we didn't know this at the time, but he actually became the first person who rioted on January 6th to go to trial and be convicted. And in the weeks leading up to January 6th, his son began to get the idea that something was up, and he didn't know what to do. He was 18 years old at the time. And he Googled how to make a tip to the FBI, and he did make a tip to the FBI. The afternoon of January 6th was when the FBI called him back. But, you know, the family has been sort of wrestling with the after effects ever since.
I guess one of the things, and I think you do talk about it on the podcast, but if you could talk about it now, I think for a lot of people, I think they can't imagine what would have motivated the people who participated in the insurrection to have done so, right? Why were they there? I mean, you talked about the president's persuasiveness, but we actually had in a local election recently a candidate who said, well, I was there on January 6th, but I didn't attack the Capitol. Where does this come from?
Well, I mean, I think, so there's an episode of the podcast, I mentioned Michael Fanone, and, you know, one of the things that happened in the course of the inquiry is that there's an individual named Danny Rodriguez who's charged with attacking Michael Fanone, tasing him twice. And the entire videotape of his FBI interrogation was released, and they asked him that question. How did you become this guy? And, you know, at some points in the interview he's defiant, and at some points he's kind of cagey, but at one point he just kind of breaks down. And he was like, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was doing what my president told me to do. And, you know, I learned this from InfoWars, and I was Fox News, and I was hearing this information. I think he said Fox News. He definitely said InfoWars. Alex Jones was this huge influence, and that I thought I was doing the patriotic thing. And I think that's the danger, is that, you know, and I asked Michael Fanone, I asked him about Danny Rodriguez, and he said, I don't think he's truly evil. I just think he's somebody who got incredibly bad information. And that sort of, you know, goes back to this question of the problem is when you can't tell what's the truth. So, and, you know, that poll is alarming but not surprising.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the local civic leader who I would say is a true independent, votes for both Democrats and Republicans. And I talked to him about the fact that we were doing the Tennessee Democracy Forum. We were working to try and build a pro-democracy conversation in Tennessee. And he said, well, you know, I think a lot of people who supported President Trump, and even people who may have participated in the insurrection and don't believe the results of the election, they think they're being patriots. They are pro-democracy because they think that somehow the system was rigged and they're fighting for the true outcome.
I think that is true. And I think that you know, one of the things that held in 2020 was that Republican election officials in Arizona, in Georgia, many of whom we saw testify in the January 6th committee hearings, basically said, we are, not going to stand for this. We are people who came here to do a service, and our public service was to certify this election, and it was, not a fraudulent election. So I do think that there still are people across the country from both political parties whose, primary mission is not a partisan mission, but it's becoming very hard for them. And, I have some concerns about whether just how difficult it is actually being sort of taken seriously, because you have people who are elections officials who, are doing it in a sense of public service, or, maybe they're doing it, they're working at home because they need the money, but, for whatever reasons, they're, not doing it to undermine the system. And when those people have a big backlash, what happens? Well, they walk away. And that is, very concerning. So I absolutely think, one of the things that is troubling now is that the language of democracy, sort of rigged election, I'm standing up against corruption, these are terms that are deployed by both sides. And, one of the things that we learned as we were, really saw in stark relief as we was working on our podcast is there's a mirroring in the language that goes on between who is the patriotic person, who is pro-democracy, but, I think that there are some things we know. We know that Joe Biden won the last election in elections in states that were certified by Republicans. And when people start to quibble about those basic facts, I think then you can sort of understand how it's, these terms are being used by some people as weapons.
I keep going back, again, both having grown up in New York government and politics, to Senator Moynihan's quote about everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not entitled to their own set of facts. And that now seems like a little bit of a quaint notion.
I think that, one of the things that's happened, and I think that, the pandemic really exacerbated it, is people are sort of, kind of have scurried off into their own corners. And, great institutions like public universities, like town squares, like places that even the very notion of gathering together has, come under attack. And I think that, that is something that needs to be knit back together.
Just for people here and also online, I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, but if I could ask sort of for a collection of whatever cards people may have filled out for questions, we could get to some of those. And then also, if there are any questions that have come in online, that would be great as well. So let's talk about the January 6th committee. Let's talk about their hearings. You've devoted a lot of your life to the last couple of years to covering President Trump and to January 6th. Any surprises to you that came out of this hearing?
Yeah, I was surprised every minute of those hearings. Just the fact of them was a surprise to me. One of the things that was interesting is that, the initial idea that wasn't actually political people. It was just, presidents of universities and policy experts and maybe some former prosecutors, and they were going to investigate this and come back and give a report to Congress. Well, the Republicans killed that idea. So what happened was that Nancy Pelosi then created a select committee, and Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, put forth a slate of candidates who to serve on the committee who actually didn't believe in investigating what happened, and she rejected them. So what you have is this committee of 7 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and they are all committed to getting at the truth. And this is an oversight function that we have not seen in modern history. So what has happened? They have subpoenaed probably thousands of people at this point. They've gotten millions of documents, and they presented a lot of this in these hearings in a way that was just from the sake of somebody who's been trying to understand the facts, the truth, felt very satisfying. And I think we really learned a lot from what they did, and I think it's very important because there's still a prediction that the House will not be controlled by Democrats, and that is the end of this committee. And I feel like for history, the fact that we have these documents have been taken means a lot, even if it's just the fact that the story is preserved.
As we sort of, we're going to the midterms in a couple of months, and then, you know, almost instantly we're then only 2 years away from the next. Reason to believe that we're not going to just see a repeat of everything that we saw in 2020, if not worse?
I mean, you know, there's always some new thing that's coming at us. I think we've all learned. I think that, you know, we all need to treasure our public institutions and need to be committed to this project of democracy. That most people were shocked by what happened on January 6th. And I suspect that there are people who, you know, saw what happened that when push comes to shove might not want to go that way in the future. But I don't know. I mean, you know, people like Rusty Bowers, the Arizona election official who, you know, testified about Trump trying to get him to basically next time. So I think that it's unclear. And, you know, all these people who have, you know, one of the early people to testify at the hearings was Trump's former campaign manager, Bill Stepien, who, you know, sort of seemed to give kind of, you know, he's known to us. He's kind of a New Jersey before anybody else knew him. Anyway, he called himself Team Normal. And he described things that had happened, and he explained how right after the election, he went very clearly to Donald Trump and said, you didn't win, and you shouldn't contest this. At that time, he was working, now we know successfully, to win a primary campaign against Liz Cheney. So I think that it's unclear whether these people who have told the truth about what happened, you know, sort of what the next move is. I just don't know. I don't think we know.
So I guess there's movement. I guess there was movement in the Senate. I assume there would be positive movement in the House around. But the last podcast was the last one of these conversations was with Bob Shrum, and he and I got into a discourse about the Area Redevelopment Act of 1961. I'll let you explain to everyone what the Electoral Count Act is, which I think is from 1871, and whether that gives you any, you know,
it's apparently on its way to being reformed.
Right.
The House has when he said to Mike Pence, you can overturn the results of the election. And there's now been a bill that was passed in the House that says that the vice president, I'm really boiling this down, but basically says the vice president actually doesn't have power to overturn the will of the voters. And Mitch McConnell recently said he would support it. So, you know, anything can happen in this world, but as of now, it has passed one house, and the leader, you know, the minority leader of the other house has said he would go along with it, and majority leader Schumer will be some meaningful legislative reform as a result of January 6th, which, you know, sort of changes the equation, at least if it gets to Congress.
So let me ask you one last question, and then we'll take a couple of questions that have come in from viewers and from the audience. What's going to happen next? The Mar-a-Lago investigation, we've got, we talked about this a little earlier today. We may or may not have an ongoing investigation in the Manhattan DA's office. We have an investigation, criminal investigation going on in Georgia. It seems like the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District has about 38 related investigations that may or may not be going somewhere. You've got the Attorney General's civil case. You've got the final hearing of you're a journalist and you don't come with a crystal ball, but what's going to happen?
You know, people ask me, like, you know, before I was covering, Trump and his business, I covered political campaigns. And really, when you're a political journalist, there's just one question that people have. What is going to happen? That is all people want to know. Who is going to win? All that people want to get from your reporting. I don't know. All I know is, sort of my piece of the thing that I can do is be committed to the truth and to, sort of uncovering the truth in a meaningful way, in a way that helps people understand the world they live in and, useful insight.
I think we have some questions, Stacey. Thank you so much. This is a good question, particularly given the comments that you made about sort of that may have led some people to where we are today. Journalism seems unwilling or unable to adequately address the full extent of the normalization of political violence. Can you share some insights on what might be done to change that situation? And do you think that's a fair comment?
Well, I hate to say journalism because it's like, there's a lot of different journalists with a lot of different missions. What I was talking about, the shock that people felt on January 6th, people trying to process it. And, this is not journalists, this is all people. This is people in the White House who were one floor down from the president at the time trying to process it. I think it's very, very it's something that I'm really, thinking a lot about now because so many people who work in the elections apparatuses have been, threatened with violence. The former president, who knows what happens if I'm indicted? The senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, made a comment about violence in the streets. I mean, I think that we're in a very, very precarious situation. And, we saw that are very, very, people can get swept up and do things which they later regret. And some of the people who've participated in January 6th have said, I got swept up in a mob. And I think that is, sort of what is so dangerous in the moment that we're in, is that people may harbor thoughts and then they feel like they're with a group of people and they do a thing. And, political violence forever. But I think one of the things that's alarming is that some of the tools that are being used to confront the violence are from Reconstruction. So for example, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 is one of the tools that various bring about accountability and liability. So I think it is alarming that we are sort of back in this era where, that is what we are talking about. So I don't know whether I don't know who asked this question, I don't know if I would sort of hang that on journalism. I just think it's an issue, but I also feel like it's something I am paying attention to right now. I'm looking to do in the course of the next, we're in the midterms now, people have already started voting. How are people going to cool things down rather than inflame them further?
I guess, so one of the other questions, and I guess this came in online, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit, is sort of a question right about the two-party system and whether that's working well as sort of in defense of democracy right now. Governor Whitman, who you talked to, is actually one of our first guests on our first conversation on democracy with Norm Eisen. And she, I guess, with Andrew Yang, came out and said, well, maybe it's a third part, maybe we need to pursue a third party. I mean, are our old notions of the one thing we always thought, at least I always thought, was that there are all sorts of disagreements between Democrats and Republicans, but the one thing they could agree on is sort of the fundamental premise of democracy. Maybe that's not.
Described in sort of, the kind of, top Republicans to look at what happened. Historical aberration. The answer to the question is, I don't know what it means for the subsumed the. Many of you remember this, but in 2020 there wasn't actually a Republican what he wants, and I think that basically what Donald Trump has sort of told people against you, or I will. And one of the things that's very interesting is Jonathan Martin, who wrote a very good book about sort of the Republican Party before and after January 6th, reported that members of Congress told him that right after January 6th, they were appalled what happened, they wanted to come out, but in the continuing foment, they went, back to their districts and they began to receive death threats, and they became fearful. And part of what kept people quiet was actual fear of violence and of being attacked, not just politically. And that really surprised me because I'd not heard that other than from that book. And when almost, in our podcast, Will Be Wild, I interviewed many former Trump administration officials, and all of them who had in any way spoken out publicly told me how they had received death threats, how they had to have security guards to protect their families. I mean, it is but I don't know what happens if you, sort of take out these are kind of like the Republicans that would call themselves pro-democracy Republicans. I don't know what happens if you take Donald Trump out of the equation. And I think that is something that, we have to leave to history to test. Obviously Donald Trump is working quite hard not to be taken out of the equation. So I don't know that we can actually, sort of answer that question.
Well, which is the last question that came from the audience, which I was going to ask you is, do you think he's going to run?
I mean, listen, Maggie Haberman thinks it, so. I mean, I can't see why he wouldn't. Because, he likes the power, he likes the attention, and, the reason why people don't run in some occasions is they no longer want to bother. But I don't think that, I have not seen any evidence that is part of his decision making, that, he doesn't want the hassle or the bother of running for president. He just wants to go, play golf on the, in Mar-a-Lago, and he can no longer examine his letters from the North Korean leader, but, do whatever else he does at Mar-a-Lago.
If he runs and if he wins, given what we know about his term, and I think, the interesting fact pattern of nothing moving forward on the initial investigation with regard to the 2016 election in Russia, and sort of the next day or so kicking off the efforts with Ukraine, and sort of his MO over time. What does it mean for democracy if he runs and wins?
I mean, I think that we already know that he has plans to basically dismantle a large part of the civil service. The people that I know that worked for him in in, sometime while he was president, have expressed alarm. I think one of the things that we've seen, and I saw this with all the people that I interviewed, and we've seen it in the January 6th committee hearing, is people had this sort of dilemma because they were like, if I leave, who is going to come in behind me? And I do think that we did see a sort of, like somebody like Bill Barr broke so many rules as Attorney General, and then he was like, but I am drawing the line at election fraud. But then there was somebody who came in behind him who was like, well, maybe that's not where I'm going to draw. There was his sort of third in command tried to say, actually, I am going to send a letter from the Justice Department to all of the states, or I'm sorry, that was not the third in command. He was the head of, I believe, the Environmental Bureau,
Yes.
but it was a top person in the Department of Justice who, tried to become Attorney General. So I do think that, one of the things that people that I have spoken to have told me is that they are concerned about is people who would be willing to come back in a second Trump administration are none of the people who tried to put the brakes on. So you have a sort of, just a kind of, what they've articulated is basically sort of, just a runaway system where, for all of the things that Trump did, we know, largely as a result of the January 6th committee hearings, that people like his chief counsel, Pat Cipollone, who in the first impeachment was basically responsible for the non-cooperation strategy. But on January 6th, told Trump, don't do it, got angry at him, tried to put the brakes on. So, that is the kind of person that was around, and I don't think you're going to be seeing people like that in a second Trump administration based on what people have told me. So what you're going to have is people who have just, sort of full on are going to, would go along with the program, I would expect.
An interesting place to end it, but
No, I want to say one thing.
Go ahead.
Most of you have my book in your hands. The last word of the book is hope. And I really thought a lot about this because I don't want to say like, here's 425 pages of really difficult issues, and so be hopeful. But I wanted to think about what hope means in the world. And I don't think, hope is the same as like a false optimism or just a belief that everything is going to turn out right. For me, hope is a feeling of action in the world, that you can continue to act in whatever way you can to, sort of uncover the truth and tell these important stories and, fight to uphold institutions. All of these things are things that we all can practice in our lives. And I think that is the fact that, you do what you do and I do what I do, and all of you in this community are doing what you do. To me, that is hope. It's a practice. It's like yoga. You never get it right, but you just keep doing it. And one of these days, I still believe I will be able to do the crow pose.
We'll end with the crow pose, but also with hope. Andrea Bernstein, thanks so much for coming to Chattanooga.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And for participating in this conversation on democracy. Thank you to our hosts here at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. We will be back here on October 21st. We'll be playing a day game on the 21st. That afternoon we'll have Salim Giverghese, who is a native Chattanoogan, coming home to talk about some issues around economic democracy. Thanks again to everybody from the Tennessee Democracy Forum, which is a project of Forward Tennessee. If you haven't already, check us out on Twitter and Facebook and all other forms of social media, and sign up so that you'll be invited to future forums as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.